Hey guys, if you're looking for an easy way to water your newly planted trees and plants and to automate the process, stay tuned. I'll walk you through how I set up our simple, efficient, and affordable above-ground drip irrigation system. I hope this gives you some ideas and inspiration for your irrigation project, and let's get to it. First step, let's get the pipe out of the back of the truck, get it under the sun so that it uncoils nicely and is easier to work with. For today's project, we'll use 1/2-inch drip irrigation tubing, which is a poly tube, and we'll punch holes in it at each tree or plant you want to irrigate. We'll use a long tape measure to get an idea of how many feet of tubing will need to be ran, and to find the center point for where I'll put a T-fitting to be able to split the main line into two sections, one going to the east and the other to the west. My wife and I transplanted a few small trees last fall that we're needing to irrigate on a consistent basis, and we put a water tank in the back of the side-by-side and then watered each tree, but it took a lot of time and we sometimes forgot or didn't have time to water as much as we'd like, so we basically needed a better way to get water to them so we can keep the trees healthy and growing and to have the system automated. We also planted a few new evergreens and aspens this spring, so I wanted to get them watered as well. On a warm day, the tubing will relax in just a few minutes, and it's going to make it easier to lay out. Next thing we'll do is pull the tubing all the way down to that far tree, and then I'll hold it in place with some yard staples. If you're doing a larger system like us, you'll lose some water pressure the longer your system is due to the friction of the water against the tubing, and the number of drippers used will also affect the capacity of your drip system. Now, there are plenty of websites out there with planning tools and calculators to determine what size tubing you should use, the supplies needed, and to explain and answer questions you'll have. I actually stumbled across dripdepot.com's YouTube channel, and they had all sorts of free and helpful videos. I've done a few smaller drip systems for plants and flowers in the past, but I've never done anything of this size, so those tutorials were super helpful for me. You'll quickly learn the method that works best for you to lay out the hose, and you'll find that you'll most likely get some kinks as it uncoils, and you'll need to twist the tubing to get it to lay out straight. The great thing about a drip system is it goes together quickly, it's cheap to install, it's going to automate your watering, and it's super rewarding to complete the project. So if you're looking for a solution to make watering easy, run to your local hardware store. I was able to find all the supplies I needed at our local Home Depot so I could get started right away. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll go over some pricing information for the supplies we used and let you know the cost of our project and how many total feet of tubing we ended up using so you can get a rough idea of what your project may cost. Once the tubing was unwound and laying flat, I straightened it and pulled it closer to the trees. Now here I'm cutting at the center where the splitter or T-fitting will be put on. The section going downhill will be about 200 feet long, and the section going uphill to the east is about 250 feet in length. The main line is a 3/4 inch hose attached to the hose bib on the side of our home, and it's about 200 feet long. Now the reason I ran normal hose from the house is because we drive vehicles and trailers over the area the hose will be run, and that rubber hose holds up well to us driving over it. A threaded drip irrigation swivel is used to connect the normal 3/4 inch garden hose to the 1/2-inch tubing. I also used a pressure reducer prior to connecting to the black drip irrigation 1/2-inch tubing. I turned on the water to test the connections I'd made so far and to see what kind of pressure I had. Here I'm using a tool to make a small hole in the tubing. As you can see, the water is shooting out of the hole, and I'll use a 1/4 inch barb coupling to connect 1/4 inch hose and then an adjustable dripper close to the small tree. Then it's just a matter of repeating the process and getting into a rhythm. I cut and pre-assembled the 1/4 inch tube and barb fittings, made the hole, and then connected it. I used 4-inch yard staples to secure the tubing to the ground where needed. Once the first section was complete, I moved on to the east section. A ball valve was used at the start of the line in case I ever want to turn off that specific section. And then next, I began unraveling and laying out the tubing. This line of tubing is around 250 feet and will be watering 7 small trees. Unraveling the tubing will require a few twists and walking back and forth a couple times to get it to lay flat, but it goes quickly, and if you do get some kinks, simply work them out until they're all gone. Then I pushed the tubing onto the ball valve to connect it to the rest of the system and added a couple yard staples to hold everything in place. The tube was pulled tight, and then I'd assemble the 1/4-inch tubing to the barb and dripper. These steps are all repetitive, so once you've done one tree, it's most likely going to be pretty similar for the rest. When you get to the end, push on an end cap to stop the flow of water and to pressurize the system. Above ground drip irrigation is quick to install because you don't need to dig a trench, and you can easily modify the system to add more trees, remove trees, and to move the line. Now, one question I had was how durable it would be and if I could drive the mower over it, so I staked down some square tubing and drove over it with the zero turn to put it to the test. You definitely don't want to have the PTO activated, but simply driving the mower over the hose placed on the grass didn't damage it. The manufacturer, of course, doesn't recommend driving over it, but in case you do on a summer day, I think you'll most likely be just fine. Since installing, we've been mowing as close as we can to the tubing and then using a weed whacker to clip the grass right next to it. There are all sorts of timers you can add to the start of your drip irrigation to automate the watering process, and I have an Orbit Beehive Wi-Fi system that can be programmed and controlled from a smartphone. A backflow preventer fitting is attached downstream of the timer to prevent water from ever flowing backward. Then it was time to try out our new system, so our 2-year-old Jack and my wife Britt and our pup came out to check it out. Each dripper can be adjusted to let out between 0 and 14 gallons per hour. As I'd mentioned, there are about 200 feet of hose going downhill toward the west and then 250 feet going uphill, and there was easily enough pressure to allow plenty of water flow through each emitter. They recommend using 3/4-inch tubing for large systems and runs over about 200 feet for best results, but they didn't carry 3/4-inch tubing in lengths longer than 100 feet locally, and it was significantly more expensive. So I decided to go with the 1/2-inch tubing, and honestly, it works great for watering the 13 small trees in this row, which has been installed for 2 weeks so far. Here's the last tree on the system, which is a ponderosa pine, and it's where the end cap was added. The emitter casts nicely over the root ball and will provide plenty of water to help the tree continue to grow. The 1/4-inch tubing that goes to each tree is cut to around 1 to 2 feet in length, and it allows you to easily place the emitter where you want it to go and to move it as needed or adjust it when you need to. You can easily swap out and use different drip emitters and styles to broadcast the water in different patterns and amounts. Here's a look at the completed system from the start of the house. The timer, backflow preventer, and then garden hose are attached to the hose bib on the house. The hose then runs out from the house under the deck, and then about 200 feet where the threaded adapter and pressure reducer convert to the 1/2-inch tubing, which is then split with a T and run in 2 different directions. To the right, the line goes uphill about 250 feet with 7 trees, and to the left is a row of 6 trees and about 200 feet of tubing. Like I mentioned, I've done a few smaller drip systems, but nothing close to this size, and I didn't spend a ton of time with calculations as I just sort of built it in sections at a time and then checked that it had enough water pressure and was working. After testing it a few days, I decided to take a chance and to see if I'd be able to extend the irrigation across our front ravine and then back up to the front of our yard where I had some larger trees to water. To extend the system, I removed the end cap, made a fresh cut on the tubing, and then pushed on a ball valve that could be turned on and off at this spot as I tested things to see if it would work and have enough pressure. The flow here is still looking really good, so I got out another 500-foot reel of 1/2-inch tubing and began unraveling it. I pulled the tubing alongside the fence, across the ravine, and then back up to the larger trees on the other side. A little more unraveling of the tubing, and then I was able to connect it to the other side of the valve and use some yard staples to place the tubing tight against the ground and to direct it at an angle toward the fence and then across the ravine. All right, here's the test. Here's the hose on the other side of the ravine, and I'm hoping there's still decent water flow so I can water the 7 additional trees toward the front of the property. I checked the end of the tubing and still saw good water flow, so I continued adding onto the irrigation system by using a push-on coupler at the splice to add additional tubing. The rest of the 500-foot reel was laid in place, and then I cut the end at the farthest tree in the row. I installed a valve at the end to be able to check the flow at the last point of the line, and again, still plenty of pressure to water all the trees. These taller trees are around 5 to 6 feet tall with 30 to 36 inch root balls, and the emitter I'm using on this tree has the ability to cover up to 6 feet, so I feel like it will be plenty of water. Now you could certainly do a ring around the tree if you'd prefer, but I think this will be sufficient at least for this year. I'm not a sprinkler or a tree expert by any means, so if you have any tips or advice, comment below as I'd love to hear from you. This is the last tree in the row, which is a newly planted 6-foot ponderosa pine. The dripper being used on this one casts up to 6 feet, and as you can see, has plenty of pressure along with the other 19 trees. I really like this style of dripper, which is basically a small sprinkler, and I think I may use it on the rest of the taller trees as I feel it will get good coverage. There's one more tree across the driveway, so I figured I'd add on so every newer tree has irrigation. For this tree, I added a disconnect to the tubing so I can unhook it, except for when it needs watering a few times a week. I drove over it a couple times with the side-by-side to test out its durability over gravel and didn't have any issues, but I don't want to risk heavier vehicles and the UPS and FedEx trucks going over it. So I can easily roll it up out of the way and put it near the tree when not in use. I'd highly recommend using a timer to automate your drip irrigation. The Orbit Beehive I set up can be programmed using the app, and you can adjust all sorts of things like how long to run the sprinklers, what time, which days, and it even looks at the forecast, so it's not going to water if it knows there's going to be rain. And you can manually turn the system on and off from your phone too. Now this timer was about $60, but you can find non-Wi-Fi timers in the $25 to $40 range, which will do the job just fine. As far as cost, each 500-foot reel of half-inch tubing was about $50, and the rest of the main supplies, including that tubing, totaled to about $180. Now this doesn't include the cost of the timer, the PVC cutter, or hole punch, but as you can see, this project is super affordable, and if you have a smaller area, you'll likely spend quite a bit less. I'll link to the Wi-Fi timer in the description below in case you're interested in it, and to the Drip Depot website in case you can wait a couple days to get your supplies, as they do have really good pricing. It took me close to 3 hours to set up the initial irrigation system, and then installing the additional irrigation a few days later toward the front of the property took about 2.5 hours to complete. So it was definitely a pretty quick and rewarding project. After completing our system, I ended up using about 975 feet of tubing, and this was all that was left. Every dripper works great, and I was surprised I was able to get to all 20 trees. If you're wondering the flow rate of your water supply, simply time how long it takes to fill a 5-gallon bucket. I can fill a 5-gallon bucket in 60 seconds, which translates into 300 gallons per hour. Now you can learn more about flow rates and all the technical stuff on YouTube channels that specialize in drip irrigation if you want to learn more. My hope is to give you an idea of how to build a drip irrigation system to water your trees or plants so they continue to grow and stay healthy, and to automate the process so you can spend more time doing what you want and with your family instead of watering trees. If you can cut some pipe, punch some holes in it, and push and snap some plastic pieces together, then you can totally tackle this project, and I know it's going to be worth it. All right, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed checking out the process of how we did our above ground drip irrigation system. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And thanks again for watching. Cheers from Montana.